Welcome to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It's good to be with you again today, listener. I'm glad you're here. I hope you've enjoyed our recent episodes. We've had some great guests, Rich Lusk, Michael Foster. Today on the show, we've got Charles Jacoby. He is a friend I met online, as are many friends that we meet online today, and I am glad to have him as a friend and count him as such. Charles, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Chase.
Now, we're going to talk about an article you wrote for American Reformer. I think it needs more attention because I think it's such an important topic for just the normal churchgoers today. And you deal with a topic that comes up in Bible studies, small group studies. It's just kind of common, the lingua franca of, just evangelicalism. Love the sinner, hate the sin. And so before we do that, though, I wanted to get into some of your kind of background. And so I wanted to hear some of your story related to like growing up in the church, where you're at now, what do you do for work? Because, many people out there may not know, who is this guy writing for American Reformer? Is this a pseudonym? Who is this guy? So Charles, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I'm currently a master's student at the Department of Biological Sciences at Texas Tech University. I was in a doctorate program, but now I'm just going to get the 2 masters and leave. So I'm a writer, so managing editor of Moonshine Magnolias magazine, and I've been writing for a couple of years now. I have stuff at American Reformer, I have stuff at Hyperion Commentary, Providence Magazine, and I have some stuff at Theopolis. And so the pseudonym CJ, I go by CJ on Twitter, and that's kind of because I work in a university setting, though I've just disclosed myself, it's kind of like a smokescreen for, to be anonymous. So if you search Charles Jacoby on Twitter, it's a little hard to find me because it's not in my profile. So is it a pseudonym? Yes and no. CJ is just my initials. And so that's kind of the whole backstory behind, my online presence. Being in the university system, try to have a little bit of a smokescreen to not get canceled. So,
yeah, that makes sense. So with you being in the university, you're going for a PhD, getting a master's. Tell me about more of your church background, theological training, anything like that. What got you interested in the topics you write about?
Right. So I'll start at conversion, and then I'll get to my research, which is kind of related to what I write about. So I grew up nominal Roman Catholic, was born in a Roman Catholic home. Didn't profess the faith, didn't know what was going on, etc. Professed atheism when I was quite young. I remember at the age of 12, I understood atheism and I professed it. But then I attempted to live out that atheism, throughout college and etc. And I basically had like a Dostoevsky existential crisis where I was, I didn't know what was going on. I was unable to justify, ethics. I was unable to justify all these kind of existential feelings I was having. It kind of fell into nihilism. And out of that nihilism, the Lord used that, and I, eventually was converted. Learned about the gospel, etc. All those things. And I was saved in a Church of Christ, actually. And then within the span of, say, 2.5 years, I went from Church of Christ all the way to Westminsterian straight up. So it's been a really long, it's been a short, but it's been a very deep theological journey. And segueing into things that I write about. So I write a lot about emotionality. So I have some things on Hyperion Commentary talking about emotions. Obviously, this article is based on the emotion of hatred. And my master's research is actually, it is based on emotions. So I study basically how does the nervous system make decisions in certain emotional contexts. So it's kind of like brainiac stuff, but how does fear and reward influence the way we think, and the way we make decisions? So we might call that the will. How do we come up with our decisions, things like this. So that segues into the things I write about. That's what I find most interesting. I don't know why I find it interesting. I just do. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of my writing and my research kind of blend together in that sense.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, this is a topic for listeners out there. They may know this, they may not, but it's a topic I've often dwelled upon. Whether it's a Dostoevsky type experience I've had as well, but just coming from my background, being feeling very disenchanted with modern life at an early age. I never got into like the thick books like a lot of guys do. I was just more of an emo kid listening to angry, sad music,
Yeah, yeah, us
But
too.
the emotional dynamic, especially of conversion and growth and holiness, has always been something that has been perplexing. And I don't know that as human beings, we're very limited in what we're able to discern, even about ourselves. And yet, it's something that we constantly need to orient our hearts to the Lord and develop affections for Him. And when you study, church history, there's a lot of writing on this topic. And I think a lot of evangelicals, they equate emotionalism many times with a spiritual experience. And I keep telling people this in my life, like, many young Christians grow up in big mega churches that kind of like are prey on the emotional state of the congregant, such that like you'll go to a church service in one of these churches, very dark, loud subwoofer, drums, lights,
Yeah.
and it can be moving for a lot of people. And then they go to a concert that is pagan or not Christian at all, and they get the same kind of emotional high. And I think that setting people up on that kind of trajectory for measuring, like the barometer of my connection with God is my emotional experience with God, is just setting up people for failure, especially in an age where they can get so many emotional kind of dopamine hits from
Yeah,
games and videos and all sorts of technology in life. And
sure.
so this is something I deeply care about as well. And not only that, but like the the reality that as humans we're very impressionable people. Like we're very formed by context and liturgy and different things like that.
Mhm.
So I'm glad you're interested in that as well. One thing about your research, and I wanted to get into with the masters you're doing, it's not a philosophical degree you're getting, though, is it? Or is it? It's kind of a scientific degree.
Yeah, so both my masters are they're masters of science. So my background is actually STEM based. I don't have any philosophical training. I don't have any formal training in literature. My entire background is purely empirical, actually. Um, but I write about the emotions and stuff like that kind of on the side as a segue out of that research. So actually, the foundation of my professional career is actually in wildlife biology. So literally going out into the woods and like collecting wildlife samples. But then out of that, I became interested in animal behavior, which is the field of ethology. And then from that, I started writing about when I was so I got converted, and then from me being interested in animal behavior, I began writing about behavior of humans, obviously in a theological context. But once I'm done with this master's, I will go into something that is, not philosophically based. It'll be, working with either environmental sciences, or perhaps like biosafety, something like that. So my full training is all empirical. It's not philosophical.
Okay, good to know. That yeah, that's I think that makes a good mix of it's kind of like I always wanted to be kind of a Renaissance man, being able to like build
Yeah,
homes and
yeah,
also read
all
thick
grades.
books. So I think there's some good prudence in that, and it makes for a well-rounded person. Um, so let's get into the article
Sure.
um, called "Hatred, Holy," and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. We start out talking about modern emotional pietism. So I wanted you to kind of walk us through what is modern emotional pietism in your understanding, and why is it a problem?
Yeah. So I call it modern emotional pietism because we obviously, I think the modern evangelical, we're very pietistic about our emotions. And when I say that, I mean most of the or all of the good emotions are viewed in a positive light. And so all of the good emotions, love, patience, kindness, all these things are seemingly positive because they are they're not dealt with a nuance that the quote unquote bad emotions are: anger, hatred, frustration, things like this. So in modern evangelicalism, if you are let's say you're a disagreeable man, let's say you're a man that is perhaps more aggressive, perhaps you have more testosterone flowing in your veins, and you're not scared to, conflict, things like this. When you express these bad emotions, quote unquote bad emotions, the modern emotional pietist is going to immediately view those in a skeptical light. And they're going to kind of handle them with white gloves and talk about them and do all their qualifications. So that's kind of what I mean by modern emotional pietism, that we're trying to be overly holy in the sense that only these seemingly good emotions are the things that should be cherished. I think underlying that is a little bit of, you can throw a Gnostic on anything,
Sure.
but these other base emotions we have, they're viewed as, oh, these are non-spiritual, these are animalistic, and we should view these in a bad light. So that's what I mean by the term.
Yeah, it's a helpful term, and I've talked about pietism on the show before, but it's a major issue in the American evangelical church, and I think the real danger gets even into how we read history and how we read, and that's why we're going to get into it with Calvin and other people, but how we read back not only into history, but I'll go somewhere I didn't think I was going to go, but even like a show like The Chosen, which I've never watched,
Here we
but I know
go.
I know some people have. From clips or from what people have told me, you look at how they portray interactions and how they represent communication,
Mm-hmm.
and it's saturated with this modern emotional pietism. It's almost impossible. It's not impossible, but it feels impossible many times for us as modern people to look back on ancient people or just people from 200 years ago and almost read, as a good historian should, read understanding their context, understanding our own context, and how we read our own preferences into even the Word of God, and not just the Word of God, portrayals of Him, which might be a second commandment violation or not, but even portrayals of Him, and that gets
Yes.
really murky, because then all of a sudden you get a bunch of Christians who are now equating the chosen with, well, this is how Jesus experienced emotion. Have you seen that come up as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny when you say that, because when you bring up the chosen, Jesus, we have to be honest. Jesus was meek. That is a fact, but that doesn't abrogate the fact that he called the Pharisees the sons of Satan, right? So if you're going to, Jesus didn't say that he hates them. He didn't say that verbally. But if you're going to say that you hate anybody in any language, calling them the son of Satan is pretty dang close.
Yeah.
So the way that Jesus is portrayed, particularly in our minds as well as the chosen, is those good emotions. You can see that emotional pietism. He's always acting in that state. Those are always highlighted, to where his angry emotions, which were just as powerful as his meekness, it's not portrayed as much. And it does a disservice to the scriptures, most certainly.
Yeah, the other issue I would see for some evangelicals could be even kind of an emotional prosperity gospel that's preached, and this is
Yeah.
common in preaching, where you've got basically Jesus is kind of like going to make it's a therapeutic deism. It's like
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
become a Christian, you're going to only feel positive emotions, and if you feel negative emotions, there's something either wrong with you, or it's a sin, or those aren't welcome
Yeah.
here. And for good or for ill, at our church, we're pretty like, hey, like, just come as you are to the Lord, come to worship as you are. There's no need. I think it's always good to aim. I mean, my brother and I were talking about this because my brother's getting his master's in counseling, and for the secular psychologists, they can study the power of optimism, and how it actually changes kind of your brain waves and how you succeed in life. And I think there's something to that Christians can learn, but the danger becomes when it becomes kind of a, your best life now type, like if you can just
Yeah.
think things into existence. And I see that in a lot of preaching, where they want to avoid offense because they don't want to produce ill emotion in anyone. They don't want to, make anyone think less of us. And so, yeah, it's a big topic. So with this modern emotional pietism, the phrase you pinpoint is hate the sin, love the sinner. And I just can't tell you how rampant this is. I mean, it's just rampant. That's a negative connotation, and we'll critique it for sure. But it's pervasive. We could use that. That's less negative, but it's ubiquitous. It's all over the place. You'll hear this sentiment and how we express hatred towards, well, we don't hate that person, we just hate the sin. And I think that gets people in a bind. Why do you think that gets people in a bind so much?
So it's a problem because the phrase "hate the sin, not the sinner," there is a sense in which some of it is true. But when the modern evangelical says that, they mean we hate the sin, and there are no negative connotations that are directed actually at the sinner, at the person doing the bad thing. So it gets people in a bind because it's unnatural. So our experience confirms that when we have an evil agent doing something to us or against God's ordinances, for example, these cartel guys that are dragging babies through the razor wire, when we see that, we naturally hate that man that's doing that. That is our natural inclination. We don't think that there's this abstract sin existing above them, and that our hatred is only pointed at that. That doesn't really comport with reality or reason at all. So it takes the modern evangelicalism and it makes them live unnaturally, kind of in a sense that doesn't, kind of almost in an emotional schizophrenia, like, because you naturally hate this man doing these terrible things, but your hatred cannot actually be pointed at that object or be satisfied in any meaningful sense. So it doesn't comport with nature at all in my mind. So I began, kind of getting into this. I realized this within myself early in my conversion. I was your evangeli type, but hate the sin, not the sinner, all these things. But the problem I ran into is that, okay, I naturally feel hatred towards evil men. And this whole article was kind of me resolving, how is it that we can hate like David hates, in a meaningful sense. So to answer your question, it's just unnatural, I think. And we'll talk about prelapsarian Adam, but basically if prelapsarian Adam had anger and hatred for, if those were base emotions in him when he was in the garden, then it naturally follows that those things are implanted in us by God, which is what Calvin says. So that's how I would answer that.
Okay, great. So then, you bring up Calvin, always a great resource to pull from. Just so much writing you can use. I use him regularly in my commentaries in preparation for messages, for sermons. And so when Calvin writes on Psalm 139, I love that you pinpointed this. I actually forgot it until I read the article again this morning. But I taught Psalm 139 at my kids' school for chapel this week. And you get to the end of it, and it's the part most people ignore, right? It's the part that up until then, it's like God knows everything, God made everything, God made you uniquely. And then all of a sudden David goes off, And of course, at the end, he submits all of it to the Lord and says, "Sir, know my heart." And so, but most evangelicals don't know what to do with those psalms, the imprecatory psalms, the psalms that curse, these kind of things, because we've been so kind of blinded by our modern age. And so, when you were reading Calvin and you present Calvin, do you think Calvin endorses this concept of hate the sin and love the sinner? And if no, why not? And if he does, how so?
So he does, but not in the way that the modern evangelical means when they say hate the sin, not the sinner. So I can just, because Calvin's language, it doesn't line up with how the modern evangelical thinks, and so I can just read what he says about it. So let me see if I can find the quote here. So Calvin commenting on Psalm 139. So he almost echoes it to us in the commentary. He says, "We are to observe, however, that the hatred of which the psalmist speaks is directed to the sins rather than the persons of the wicked." So he almost says that, but if you if you continue on, if you read it, he says, on the other hand, is a proof of our having a fervent zeal for God when we have the magnanimity to declare irreconcilable, basically declare war with,
Irreconcilable. Yeah,
yeah, man, I can't speak, sorry, with the
you're good.
wicked and them who hate God, rather than court their favor at the expense of alienating the divine layout. So Calvin is declaring war against the wicked. And then at the same time, he says, we hate the sin, not the sinner. So it seems obvious that he is not saying that phrase in the same sense the